And reading to you from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, the first 15 verses. Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses! And he said, Here I am. And then he said, Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said further, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. And then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of Israel has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain. But Moses said to God, If I come to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your ancestors has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? What shall I say to them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. He said further, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Thus you shall say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. The word of the Lord. Amen. Who are you? Does that sound like a strange question? Well, there's a very good reason that Moses asks. I mean, here's the Bible, and look where this story falls. And look at all the bits that come later. Back here are all the parts about Jesus, the Gospels, the letters, Peter and Paul and Mary. And back here we also have Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah. If this is all we'd had up here, we would also lose the histories with their stories of David and Saul and all the other kings. Take out the Psalms, take out Joshua and most of the Exodus and the trek into the wilderness. There's not much left, is there? Just this little bit. The only bits that come before Moses are some stories about which the scholars call the prehistory. Stories about creation and Noah and Babel, and a family history of ancestors long dead. That's all Moses has to go on. So no wonder he asks, Who are you, God? What's your name? I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham and Isaac, the God of Jacob. Well, yeah, but what does that really tell Moses? I'm sure that in the desert nights around the fires, those ancestors have spoken of the encounters with a mysterious God that they could neither see nor touch. And remember that Moses has grown up in Egypt. Say God, and surely his mind must have asked, is this Amun-Ra, God of the sun, or Thoth of the moon? Perhaps Osiris or Isis of the underworld? is this Nut, goddess of the sky. If I go back to Egypt, back to this people who formed the work crews to build temples to such gods, surely they will ask, well, which god sent you, Moses? You're going to need to know. What is your name? What shall I tell them? I really need a little more information here. So it is that God gives to Moses God's name. And it's a form of the verb to be. God's name is a verb. My name is a noun, so is yours and yours. But God's name is a verb. A verb names an action or a state of being. I am, says God. That's my name. Remember that for ancient people, names carried meaning. It wasn't just a handy title. It told you something of who this person was. Jacob means cheat or liar, until his heart was changed and he became Israel, the one who wrestles with God. Isaac means laughter, because his mother Sarah laughed when she was told that she would have a son in her old age. When Moses asks to know God's name, he wants to know something of the very nature of God's own self. I am. What does that tell Moses? And what does it tell us? If Moses wants to learn something about this God whose name is a verb, then he must look and see what it is that God is doing. Now, you and I have all those extra pages in the Bible, and we have thousands of years of witness. Moses had far less. He had to discover God as he went along. And in a sense, that's what all of us do. As much as other folk can tell us what they've learned of God, it isn't until we experience it for ourselves that the words and the doctrines and the deeds really have meaning for our own lives. All that Moses has at this point is some witness from those who've gone before, but it's enough that when the voice claims to belong to the God of his ancestors, he can begin to connect the voice to some long ago events. Enough that he's willing to step out in obedience to the call that's come to him. It's in that business of following that he begins to discover who God really is. And what does he discover? Well, first, that God does not sit remote and far off in the heavens, but rather that God hears the cry of God's people. And when God hears, God acts. That's why God has called out to Moses. I have heard their cry, and I have come down to deliver them. What happens next? Well, there's all that stuff that makes for a good movie, Pharaoh's not about to lose the economic power of the slaves, so of course he resists when Moses comes with his demand, let my people go. And then we see God's means of persuasion, plagues and frogs and flies and boils and death. This is a God who could call the forces of nature into the struggle. And each of these plagues has some naturalistic explanation, as does the later rolling back of the sea so that Israel can escape the soldiers that Pharaoh will send, or the arrival of the manna and quails to feed hungry people in the wilderness. Any of those can be explained, but not why they should happen just when most needed. They were the tools used by God to help free people that God cared for. After all, this is the creator of the universe. The world belongs to God, and God can use it. Now, at this point, I need to sidetrack just a minute because I don't want to believe the impression that every time the forces of nature become destructive, God's decided to do in some group of people. I don't think God was out to destroy the wine industry in Napa Valley this week. No. Nature has its own freedom, even as do individuals. The rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous, says Jesus. Nature simply happens. Yet there are times when God steps in to use whatever tools are necessary to achieve God's intent. Later, much later, God will step into human life, not in nature, but in Jesus of Nazareth, to rescue God's people, who are all people, from bondage to sin and death. When God hears, when God decides, God acts. Even more, God acts on behalf of those who are unable to act for themselves. God weighs in on the side of slaves, the oppressed and the powerless, not on the side of Pharaoh. It should be a warning to us. If our nation was assigned a role in this story, would we be Israel? Not a chance. Like Egypt of its day, we are the richest and most powerful nation on earth. And we need to remember that when we are unjust or oppressive. Because when God steps in, it is not on the side of the rich and the powerful. What is your name? My name is a verb. And the nature of ancient Hebrew is such that all we have are the consonants and not the vowels. Without the vowels, it's hard to tell whether this name is present tense or future tense. I am, or future tense, I will be. I am who I am, or I will be who I will be. Both are true. But in the latter, I hear God laughing at those of us who try to pin God down, who try to say, God is like this. I will be who I will be. We don't get to choose who or how God is. God chooses. I think of that when I hear folks say, well, I don't believe thus and so about God. Fine, you have the freedom to do whatever you like. But the reality is that God decides who God will be. You know, I can decide that cucumbers are red. But that has absolutely no effect on the cucumbers. They stay green. We do not get to determine the nature of God. And neither do we determine what God will do. There is a radical freedom to this God who will be what God decides to be. What we can do is watch and listen and learn and follow. Like Moses, we can dare to step out when God calls your name. Like Moses, we can be part of God's action in the world. And that, my friends, is a great privilege. Thanks be to God. Amen.